You can have a strategy, but if you can't execute on it, what does it matter? One of the misconceptions is that consumers are paying attention to your strategy. They're not. They never will. They'll only pay attention to your story. Story, story, story.
Hey, you're on my mind, you know.
What can leaders learn from Hollywood? In this episode of In Good Company, we're going to find out. In Hollywood, attention isn't a nice to have, it's survival. If you can't earn it, the project doesn't get funded, the story doesn't get told, and no one ever sees it. And increasingly, that's the challenge that leaders are facing too. So today, we're digging into what Hollywood can teach leaders about influence, storytelling, and getting things done. My guest today has spent 30 years working at the sharp end of that attention economy. Andrew Panay is a film producer and founder of Panay Films. He's made feature films like Wedding Crashers and Van Wilder, and he's led major creative work for global brands, including producing Super Bowl campaigns for companies like Microsoft and T-Mobile. I can't help feeling that the leadership topics that we get regularly discuss on this show, influence, collaboration, working in uncertainty, might be exactly what Andrew has navigated his entire career, just in a very different environment. So let's get started. Andrew, welcome to In Good Company. Thank you for joining us today. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you here. Thank you very much for giving us some of your time today. So let's give our audience the opportunity to get to know you a little bit better. So we'll start with the question we always ask, which is to introduce yourself in 60 seconds.
Okay, well, I'm Andrew Panay. I started interning at Disney at 18, 19 years old. Started making movies. My first film was She's All That. Then I started writing my own stories, which led to Van Wilder and Wedding Crashers, and then went on to do He's All That, 20-something odd years later.
Yeah.
And delved into the advertising world 14 years ago with a commercial by the director named John Chu, which went viral with Microsoft. And that gave me the impetus to create an ad agency, which then went on to work with T-Mobile, Google, and Absolute Vodka, Microsoft, et cetera, et cetera. Took a group of filmmakers into that space. So that would be maybe 90 seconds. But,
I think you were well in there. Yeah. Not that we say this, but we don't put too much pressure on
maybe
you.
It was 67 seconds, but whatever it is, hopefully I came in within range. I am a filmmaker and I love to tell stories and we like to linger, but hopefully that was close.
No, it was perfect. Thank you. And gave a great insight into the wealth of experience that you bring us today. So we're very grateful to be able to tap into that experience. So let's get into it then. So it's often said that most organizations don't necessarily have a strategy problem, but they can have a story problem. Sometimes they find it difficult to get people to care. Leaders think that strategy is key, but people often, as we know, follow stories. So what do you think leaders misunderstand about storytelling, and why do you think that matters so much right now?
Well, because you can have a strategy, but if you can't execute on it, what does it matter? I mean, that's it right there. You can say you want to do a sports movie. That's a strategy. We're going to make sport movies, let's say, for example. But what's great strategy. Let's say you're Nike and you want to do sports stories, but great strategy. But then how are you going to execute that strategy if the stories don't resonate? One of the misconceptions is that consumers are paying attention to your strategy. They're not. They never will. They'll only pay attention to your story. But if your stories lather up to a strategy and it's directly correlated and you keep hitting different stories, connecting to the same strategy, eventually they'll start to catch on what you're trying to sell and you're selling both a feeling and a specific data point. But if you're asking consumers to be excited about your strategy, they just could care less. They really don't care. And so story is king and will always be king. You can see it even inside a boardroom meeting. Like at the end of the day, if you're bored, in a meeting because the story that's being told is not connecting with you and it's not hooking you in, you're not going to pay attention. We're raised with stories. It's been the beginning of time. I did this bit about the Greeks back in the day, me being Greek, which is kind of funny. But the Greek storytellers, right? The Greek mythology. These stories they still stand to this day. That's where the words Greek tragedy comes from, right? Tragedy is conflict. Conflict is story. We all live on a daily basis with conflict, and that's what creates stories. Without conflict, you don't have story. Without hurdles and I think what companies strategically are saying is, here's are the hurdles, and this is what my company is going to do to help you leap over those hurdles. But the audiences are not necessarily paying attention to what your end goal is. You have to bring them along with the story.
Absolutely. And I think, the context of, I liked what you were saying there about the consumer. Well, of course, in organizations, the consumer are the employees, the people that work in those organizations. So in order for you to follow that story and connect with, as you say, the strategy of that company, whatever it is that they're striving for, like you say, unless you are connected in with that, you are going to find it harder to engage and maybe even seek employment elsewhere, I would think.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I mean, one of the things that I found is just tell them and they will come. Tell them our strategy. We give you these things for free. They will come. Well, they're getting blasted every 30 seconds, every 10 seconds, every 15 seconds, being offered everything under the sun. Well, what's going to separate you? Why should they listen to you or believe you? Well, you have to tell a great story to hook them, so they actually get to the point where they want to listen to your quote unquote strategy for them. You ask yourself the question, I ask every leader to think this way: why? Why you? Why you?
Yeah. It's a great question. We often ask the same one. We pose that questions to leaders as well. That why should anybody be led by you? It's a question that stops people in their tracks, and you suddenly get to think about your own brand, your own story.
Well, actually, I actually will do that in rooms sometimes when I'm being told by a particular leader where we should be going. And there are times where I think, well, why you? What I would love to know what specifically you've created where I should walk into a ditch for you. Because my perspective is this, and I can say, I can back it up. And I say that humbly because I've won and I've lost, and I've felt lots of pain on my journeys where I've been in lots of test screenings with audiences where, I'll have arguments with filmmakers who are great leaders, and my filmmakers are amazing, brilliant humans. But I probably, because I make more movies than most directors, right? Because producers get to do 3 a year, 2 a year, 4 a year. Directors, it's 1 a year. It's not the same job. So I've seen more. So I can use my experience, and I will say, and it's not from remotely that I know anything. It's just from patterns and experience and been in enough rooms to be able to say, I will tell you why me is because I've seen it in too many screenings where I'm making it up, where this joke just doesn't play with an audience. It's insulting. Let's just say the filmmaker telling me this is going to land. I said, well, it's 100 out of 100 times these type of jokes don't land. They're too, for lack of better words, or too dirty, or it's too insulting to this kind of crowd. And so I'm always looking at a perspective, and I then turn the camera around on me and go, well, why me? Why should I? Why even myself? Like, maybe I don't know this world. Why should I comment on I always look to my colleague, Jennifer Gibgot, who makes movies with me. She's a female. I'm a male. It's like, I would like to know her perspective on, we make a lot of teenage movies. Well, what's the female perspective? I'm a guy. So what would you feel? So you always have to take yourself, you have to always find the humility in things and go, maybe I don't know. So ask yourself why your opinion is right. Do you have the data and the emotional intelligence to make that decision, or should you go and ask the questions? So these are really interesting. This is an interesting conversation because humility plays a really big part. Humility and experience dropping the ego plays a very big part in those rooms. You check your ego at the door, Or are you just pushing an agenda? Or can you step back from your creative and ask your own self, well, why do you think that's right?
Well, you've picked up on a few things there that I'll unpack slightly, because there's a lot of what you've talked about there around empathy and feedback. There's a whole load of stuff there of, and as you say, experience that I think is often needed to be considered within a leadership context, because as you say, you need to be able to read the room, you need to be able to have awareness both inwardly and outwardly as to how things may or may not land. You need to seek feedback from people with it to see if what you're thinking is actually going to land the way you intend it to land, and all of that does fit, I would assume, within a storytelling world, because it's how we then apply what we're thinking, how we're coming across in. And so, yeah, I was really interested to kind of pick up on that. Another thing you mentioned a bit earlier, which I wanted to pick up on, was about how we're just bombarded with content so much these days, and as a kind of a direct result, especially through social media, our attention spans have reduced, I would say, and that's happening in every industry. You know, you've made feature-length films, so you've had experience there, and now brands are wanting ideas to land in seconds, and so with every industry's fighting those shorter attention spans. So, in your career, what changes in your approach when you have to go from those fuller, longer stories to when those like messages have to land instantly? Is there a danger that we're losing something within that approach?
Well, we also have to keep in mind that the world's changed, right? It's the only thing that's guaranteed in our life is change.
Yeah.
So it depends on what kind of filmmaker you want to be. Do you want to understand where the world is going, or are you going to lead where the world is going? You know, a lot of this, remember, as far as filmmakers, we have to be about 2 years ahead of the curve. It takes about 2 years if you're lucky. By the way, that's fast. I mean, Wedding Crashers, I created 1 year, and then it developed. Then I finally sold it within that year. Then we developed it the following year, shot it, marketed it the third year. So 2.5 years. That was a bullet. That was right off the first draft that Richard Brenner and had greenlit, and New Line had gotten that off the ground quickly. If I was to look at filmmaking now, to be really honest, if you're doing a streamer, your first 30 seconds to a couple minutes better be fast. So you better hook them, because they will click off. You know, if you want to go theatrical, you have more time because people have driven to the theater. They've decided to take that. They've accepted that first act. They want to go on that journey. And as you see now, the box office is going crazy, because I think that's a product of maybe getting a little tired of the bombardment, people putting their phones down, Gen Z and younger rebelling against AI and saying, we're going to go and actually slow down. And we really don't want to make our own movies. We don't want to do that. We will, but we don't want to be forced to do it. We want to go and experience someone else's point of view. So I'm answering this in two parts, two ways. Number one, get on board. If you're going to make movies for streamers, which is the majority of movies being made today, the new world wants it quicker and faster to say, is this worth my time? Because that's what we've been used to in the last 10 years. Sorry, it's happened, right? And I believe, since I've been in the short form for 14 years now, in the 30-second, 15-second realm, that movies that I pitch in rooms are about 60 seconds. Two guys crash weddings to meet girls till one of them falls in love, right? Then they have to lie about who they are till they get caught, and then have to go get the girl in the third act. I don't know. I probably pitched you that in 15 seconds, maybe. So, well, we've always been doing it in 60 seconds, selling to heads of studios, okay? So if you take that format and you put it into the let's sell product format, well, it works, okay? So I guess what I'm saying is it depends on what medium you're playing with.
Yeah.
And a story is a story is a story, and I love all of it. If it's for Netflix, you better speed up your first act. If you're going to go theatrical, let it play out, because the people now are making a choice, which is exciting. So things have changed again, right? If you asked me this question 3 months ago, I bet you I answer it differently. I probably talked to you all about moving quickly at the top, and people just don't want it anymore. They don't want to wait. And I would have told you something different. I'll be honest with you. Absolutely. I'm happy.
I mean, I was interested by one thing that you said there, which was are you seeing a resurgence then? Are you seeing you mentioned Gen Z are sort of rebelling against AI. Is that a trend you're seeing? And
yes,
and playing out in the movie world as well?
More than a trend. It's
Right.
unanimous. I mean, I can't go into a room and have it not get absolute. I mean, you get eviscerated for talking about it.
Yeah. But
And
even
they're
with
not
the younger
saying
generations,
they hate it. Now, I'm not saying they're not going to use it.
Yeah.
They just don't. They don't want it forced upon them. They don't want to be told that they can't have experiences. They don't want to be told they can't go to the movies. They don't want to be told to make their own movie. You're not going to tell that generation what to do. So they're saying, you know what? You're not going to stop me from going to an EDM concert with 200,000 people now. You're not going to stop me from going to the movies and watching Obsession, which cost $1 million or $750K. I'm going. I'm going to go, and then I'm also going to play with AI and do my thing. But you're not going to tell me to stay home and make my own movies, because I don't want to do that. I can, if I want, I can play with it. But no, I'm going to go be with my friends. You're not going to tell me to be home and be isolated and play with my computer and my robot that's coming eventually. They don't want that.
Yeah.
They don't want that. They want the 90s, they want the 90s. They want to go back to the 80s. They want to go back to, not only that, but they want to go back to that music. They want to go to see Youngblood at a concert live. They want to go see artists that are interactive, that like a Youngblood. He's blowing up like crazy. And I went and saw him, and it's because he wants interactivity. He plays with the crowd the whole night. He doesn't stop. So I'm answering this question in multiple ways. I think it's whatever your platform is, you better tell the story in the way that audience is expecting to see it, is my answer to that question.
Yeah.
And be happy doing it. A story is a story is a story, and I love telling them. Me personally, I love it in 15, 30, 60. I love it in feature film, which is why I'm doing movies. I love it. And if I'm doing it for Netflix or Amazon Prime, then great. We'll make sure that first act is a little on the faster side, keep them hooked, and then slow down because they're locked in, and then roll it out. So, and that is what I'm giving you inside experience, inside scoops a little on how these streaming platforms are working as far as what audiences are doing when they're clicking off because they're not hooked fast enough. Which is why I think He's All That did great with Addison Rae. It's a big hit.
Yeah.
Number 1 in 78 countries. And part of that is we open up on Addison Rae, her character selling product on a computer, basically what she did back then on TikTok. And that audience that went to click on that movie was like, I'm in right away, and then we could back up and tell a story, the He's All That story, and she's going to high school and makes the bet and all those things.
Yeah.
But at that point, they're locked in, you see? So I'm not saying I would do a different opening for the feature in movie theater, but maybe
as you say, context is so important, isn't it? And again, that will apply to, or does apply rather to storytelling in organizations. There's the whole thing of the elevator pitch, which version, give me the elevator pitch version of the story you're trying to tell. But then equally, the context is important. So if there's the platform to open up, you start with, as you say, the hook, and then you can move into the sort of the body of the story when people are invested. But it's, and we haven't even got to talk about story arc yet. But that's a key part of it as well, as
Well,
as
the
you
hook,
well know.
Well, the thing that I think that I made my career on, God bless, knock on wood, is the hook. Because if you can't hook them, then you can't tell a story, can you? And I think that the key to life, I'll tell you one thing, the key to dinner parties is the hook. Once you hook, then you can roll out your fun story and hit them hard with an ending. But if you hook them, then they'll stay with you. You ever been in a dinner party where someone's meandering in their story? You're like, if this person doesn't get to the hook, I got to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
Because I cannot hang out with this story. Isn't that funny? Isn't it true though?
Yeah, no, it's very true. Yeah,
Right?
I mean, I've definitely been to parties like
Right.
that. I suspect also I have a concern that I've been that person as well. I only have to ask my wife that question.
Hey, who are you talking to over here? You know how much press training I've had to have? My team is like, can you stop like rambling on for 10 minutes and get to your point?
Well, yeah, you and me both. So I think that's all part of being human, right?
I mean, listen, my training, and I'll give you some insight because I certainly, I can tell you right now, I certainly half the time don't know what I'm doing. And that's part of the joy of making movies is like, you just try to find your way.
Yeah, of course.
But one thing that my boss used to do, it was almost like, I think it was like a Saturday Night Live skit. But let me just tell you a true story about Van Wilder, which I've never told. And I give credit to Peter Abrams, who was at the time my boss and a great mentor. These guys at Tapestry Films, Peter Abrams and Robert Levy, they really taught me, and Jennifer Gibgot, who works with me now, they taught me how to do this storytelling thing. And I used to walk into Peter's office and I go, hey, there's this guy who's been in college and he's been in school for 8 years. And then he went, I don't know. And then and then he went over here. And then I don't know what I was pitching, but let's just say it was and he would go, foot. Yeah. He's like, go, leave. He's like, go back and tell me when you can get it down in 30 to 60 seconds. Literally, he kicked me out.
So he was physically swiping
he
you
literally
out.
Goes, no. And I would get so frustrated with him and so upset, so my feelings hurt. Let me get it out. And he was what he was doing was, believe it or not, probably training me for the advertising future I was going to have, 20 years later or whatever. I had no idea that I would be doing that. But it's not just that. I sold a pitch in the hallways at Disney once to the head of the studio, Sean Bailey, and I said, family therapy, about a family therapist, the best in the world, a world-renowned therapist whose family at home is terrible. His family life is awful.
Yeah.
And he said, done, we're doing it. No joke. Go find me a writer. And I think we found $1 million writer, and we just put the deal together. I didn't go any further than that. So that day was the culmination of Peter Abrams when I was a young kid, 23 years old, teaching me how to hook, because without the hook, don't even bother.
Yeah, it's interesting. And what an experience for you as well. Like, that's obviously stuck with you. And fills you with a story that you can then tell several years down the line. Although it will have been hard, direct feedback at the time, it was something that then culminated in something massive.
Well, it definitely hurt my feelings.
Maybe that's not what we're trying to advocate for, especially with.
I wanted to get it out, but they didn't. Yeah. They weren't hurting my feelings. They weren't saying anything negative. It was beautiful, actually. It was just training me to be a great storyteller and to not bore them. And that's the thing about Hollywood. There's no attention span. We got to get this. These people are working around the clock. There's no sleep really. No one takes days off, and a head of a studio doesn't want to sit there at dinner or lunch and talk to you about. It's like, they got to go make Avatar or whatever they're doing. They're like, I remember at the head of the studio with She's All That. I'm having lunch with the head of the studio 30 years later. He's back again at Miramax. And I said, at lunch, he's all that. And that was it. He goes, let's do it. And we greenlit it at the table at lunch.
I'm going to ask you about one of your more recent campaigns that you've been working on. You mentioned T-Mobile earlier on, and I would love to hear this story actually, because how did it come to be Super Bowl, T-Mobile, and Backstreet Boys? Tell us that story. How did that come to be?
Well, I went and saw a Backstreet Boys concert in July, I think it was. I think it was their second show or third, and it just hit me. I go, this is going to be huge.
Yeah.
This is just going to be really big. And I called, I called the head of I would call him the head of the studio, President Mike Katz. And I called Brian Klugman, my partner, my creative partner. And I said, I think it's, Tell me why T-Mobile. I just had a kind of a notion, like it's what the hook is, right? That hook thing. I didn't know what the story was going to be, and
Yeah.
Lucy, I was speaking to Lucy about it, who runs creative now and T-Mobile, and she got supportive. And this other gentleman, Ronan, who's a great musician as well at T-Mobile, who works at T-Mobile. They're great artists over there at T-Mobile. They're just, and is Kaylee also, who runs T-Mobile. Like, there's a group there that are. It's very unusual to have. Not only are they great artists, but they're great visionaries. They like to push, and they supported it, and they early, and we just worked it together, and they're like, let's do this, let's rock this, and they believed in it early, and then we do what we always do. We got to find that story. We had the hook, but what's the story? And then at the we just got the spot done because we once again, in T-Mobile fashion, in terms of going big or going home, we shot it in New York over Christmas, or just after Christmas, and the storms were hitting, and we just do the schedule, and we did a 2-day shoot in one day. It was almost unbearable because it was 0 degrees here, and storms were shutting us down, and getting the boys to the T-Mobile store. It was just one of those experiences. But the Backstreet Boys were incredible. They were down to change their lyrics. They had a great time. They did their own version. At that moment, the Backstreet Boys, this is all new. Backstreet Boys coming back. Did they know or trust me to tell them that the trajectory of what the Sphere was going to be as big as it became? And so, that's how it all came together. I got to give the brand the credit. I got to give T-Mobile the credit, because I might have an idea, but they got to trust. And
so what you learned from that experience then about influence? Because we talked a lot about influence and how important that is. So what have you learned about that influence that you think maybe leaders listening to this could steal to use in their teams and organizations?
Well, this is a spiritual thing, so it's going to be tough. But T-Mobile, the leaders at T-Mobile have entrusted me because I'm a little on the outside, right? I walk the outside, and this is for all the leaders in the world that will even remotely listen. If anybody catches this, is I hear a lot about, and internal studios are great, and they have an internal studio, and they're amazing. And internal thinking is amazing. Everything's amazing. However, external thinking is extremely important, and T-Mobile values that, and I think the companies that start to devalue external thinking and thinking they can do it all themselves, I don't want to do that with my company. I have external thinkers. I'm not going to be the only internal. I don't want to become internal. I want to hear what the young kids are thinking. I want to think about what Gen Z's thinking. I want to think what the adult. I want to know anything but myself. I'm too curious. I want to hear and listen what the buzz is. And to the leaders out there, why T-Mobile is where they are, because they're willing to listen to what the filmmakers that they trust, the pop culture creators that they trust are saying. They're willing to listen to what we're saying. I'm not saying I'm right, but I have a knack, and given the movies that we've created are our company, Panay Films, that have led pop culture. I remember we talked earlier in the call at why. So why me? I'd ask myself that. Sometimes I ask myself that. Why myself, right? But I am starting to look at my career and going, well, I do have a portfolio of leading in pop culture. Addison Rae, Bradley Cooper, Ryan Reynolds. Like, they've all gone, right? Like, leading pop culture. These are artists that I started with or help maybe be a vessel to what they've been doing in their lives. I'm not, they're the gifted ones. I'm just maybe a vessel. So the only advice is be careful not to get stuck in a bubble. And T-Mobile doesn't like being in the bubble. They recognize it. What is the drumbeat of what the world is saying?
Well, I think that's it. You've hit on a key thing there, that listening skill. We've got other content that we've made all around soft skills in leadership, and listening is a massive one. And also a learning mindset, which again, you've touched on both of those things there, which is the two things I took away from what you've been talking there, and the ability to try and not be too fearful of if it was to go wrong. I think that was an interesting thing that I took away from what you were saying. And on that, we've sort of talked a bit about collaboration there, and I'm keen to get your perspective on when you're working with brilliant and potentially opinionated people. What helps you stop? Because it's kind of widely known that the film industry can have a reputation for some big egos, and you talked earlier about leaving that ego at the door. So, what helps to stop ego getting in the way of great work?
Well, I guess if you haven't run into a brick wall, just know that it's coming. And most of the filmmakers that I work with have hit that brick wall at times. And what I mean by that is whether it was the pain in the early years before they hit or why they were hitting, they hit a snag. Nobody's perfect, and that's the exciting thing about life, right? It's the peaks and the valleys and the pain that we go through as filmmakers, because you're putting yourself out there. Not everything's going to work. So I'm always asking filmmakers to remember where we come from and to point at the things that sometimes, even for myself, I really lead by example and saying, when this didn't work for me, did that ever happen to you? Did something not work for you at some point in your career? And just a reminder of, we're all human and we all have vulnerabilities, and where we have great points of view and we may be right, but you also could be wrong. And so I think the ego question, now there are times that leaders I work with, because of the position that they're in, may not always recognize that their ego is getting in the way. And that will be something I encourage every leader at every organization in the corporate world to just check it at the door, because when you do that, greatness can come of it. When you can step away from your own, whether the word is ego or even your own point of view, to look at someone else's and go, there's a really fine line. And it's a very difficult subject, because sometimes you need a point of view and you have to stick with it. So you just got to make sure when you're doing that, it's not because you're trying to anchor into something because you want to be right. You just got to make sure that you want to get what you want, which is to win, and not be right for the sake of it.
And have you found yourself having to give that feedback where you are working with somebody, and again, not when asking you to name names at all, but just thinking of examples that might have happened where you've had to step in and go, this, you said, about egos getting in the way. Has there been any occasions in your career where you've had to give somebody that feedback where you're like, we just need to take a back seat for a minute, or a step back and just reevaluate what we're trying to do?
Usually, yes, I have, but usually I'll do it when I have to check my own ego at the door, and I'll let them know, look, maybe I'm not seeing it. Let me just take a step back, because maybe I'm wrong. And I actually mean it when I say it, because sometimes, even if I get stuck on something, and I have, and sometimes I'm right, and sometimes I'm not right.
Was there a turning point that led you to learn that about yourself? Was there a certain thing that happened, or something you've gradually picked up on over the years?
I think it's you gradually pick up on it from your test screenings in movie Hollywood.
Okay.
And so, if you really anchor into something, and the audience chooses a different path than the big fight that you had, it'll humble you in seconds. So, there's some big running jokes with me and some of my filmmakers. I remember David Dobkin and I were watching Wedding Crashers. I think this moment is what's really affected me, in a test screening and our second test screening. And we were in the third act, and David wouldn't cut the third act. We're running at 2 hours. We're in a comedy, and I was so bored. And it's because I saw the movie 1,000 times and wrote the treatment for this thing. Well, no, of course I'm bored. Of course I want this to end. I probably, by the time we were done with Wedding Crashers, the movie could have been 30 minutes. I'm so bored, right? Because I'm not saying I was bored of the movie. Just you're in it for so long.
The process of going.
Let's
I
go.
understand.
Let's go. Let's get to the jokes. Let's end this. Let's go. Because
you know what's coming.
You know what's coming. So you're like, can we just? It's not funny anymore. It's not funny. It's long, and he held firm. And I remember, like, I had my elbow into the side of his. We're best friends, and I was like really giving it to him in the theater. Like, you see, no one's laughing. They're bored. I knew it. And I'm really having at it. Because him and I really had it at it before.
Okay.
Blocking the picture. I go, this is long. Got to cut it. Numbers came back. We went up 10 points. It's like pretty hard to argue the success of the film. So that's a pretty humbling moment, if I remember correctly. And actually really funny too. We had the giggles because it was, obviously he's so aware that we've been in the trenches for so long at that point. So I think that was a defining moment for me. If there was a moment that I remember very clearly.
Well, whatever results of the conversation that happened that day clearly worked, because Wedding Crashers, I remember when it first came out, and it was I thoroughly enjoyed it for one, so it obviously worked.
Well, I'm really happy that you did.
In fact, I'll try and I'll get it. I'm sure I've got it on DVD, so I'm going to go to the effort of getting the DVD out, which feels so old school nowadays, rather than use a streaming platform, I think, on this occasion, just for that tangible moment of getting the DVD, putting it in the machine. And I think that's the way we should do it.
Let's do it.
Let me move on to my next question, which is, I'm curious to know, we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but in leadership, we talk a lot about culture, how we do things here. And in your world, you've got to create that clarity of and culture very quickly. You're gathering new people together to work on a project. They're potentially not having worked together before if they're new to your team, or you're working with new people that are the talent, for example. How do you get that unified approach to create, and how do you communicate out, right, this is what we need, and we need it to be good, and this is what it's going to look like? How do you get that out there?
Well, number one, I work with a lot of the same people, so that's one of my tricks to answer your question. When it's not, it's really in the hands of the director. So how I get everybody aligned is, really through the director's leadership. I always pick directors that first and foremost can lead a group in the right direction and has a great vision as to what we want to execute. The second thing I do is I wander around the set on those days, on the particular ones, especially on the ones that are extremely challenging, to make sure that we are aligned. And I'm moving the needle and pushing and pulling behind the scenes, chatting with each department heads, and also leaders and potential. If it's commercial, it's the actors and the client and my filmmaker. So it's my job as a producer to make sure that I'm having separate conversations that are inspiring with each person and make sure that we're aligned to what we're trying to accomplish. And then it all filters through director. So if I'm hearing a little bit from here, the actor's feeling a little bit like this, the clients are feeling a little bit like that, I go to our leader, who's now the director. They're running the show at that point. But it's my job, since I hired the director, or it's clearly going to be my choice, that I'm managing the feelings on set and funneling it through the director, because ultimately they have the power. They're the ones using with the camera angles and communicating to the talent. So they will affect tone. It'll always be them that affects the tone and the spirit. I'll just make sure that it stays on the train tracks, or I have great producers that do that. So it's an art form for sure.
And there's a lot to be learned. There's so much to learn there for leaders, because I think, especially within a team, and so directly people can take away what you've just said there, is checking in by you checking in with people all around the set. There's two things that are happening there. One is that you're getting that alignment, as you said, as we talked about, but also, people, know that they can trust you because that you're being a direct point of contact to create that psychological safety within that team. So if there's an issue with anything, they know that they can come to you, whatever that issue might be. I would assume that's certainly what I took away from what you were just saying there. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would say the word that you're using, you're trying to distill into is the word safe.
Mm.
You know, you have to create a safe space. If the actor doesn't feel good in the outfit, if the client doesn't like what's going on over here, and if the filmmaker doesn't like what the notes are, they have to feel safe to come to one leader to say, I don't like this and I don't like that. And I have to make sure that everyone feels really good about what they're doing and gets what they want. It's a very fine line. It's a very tricky job. But if they feel safe to come to you to have a discussion about their hair because they don't like it, then they're going to feel safe about anything. One little thing can throw you off, can throw off a performance, can throw the client, one mistake, you could not be able to sell your product. You didn't shoot it right. So it's a very important job, a producer. Nobody knows what we do. So because it's a hard job to explain. I would say that we're the best utility players in the business, is how I would call it.
Well, I think I think that's a great sort of top tip that our audience listening to this can really take away from today's episode, which is, and again, I don't think there's a secret source necessarily for it, but making people feel safe, particularly with a team, is gonna, and particularly if we can create a culture around that within an organization, that's got to be high up there on people's agenda. We have reached the end of our questions for today, so it's been fascinating talking to you, and I'm so grateful to giving us your time. I feel like I've learned loads and could talk to you for a lot longer, but I'm going to give a moment for reflection for yourself, which is, and we asked this question to all our guests, which is if you had the opportunity to speak to your younger self as you embarked on your career, what would be the best piece of advice you would give yourself?
I think I've spent a lot of time in fear, in that trying to control the universe, right? My kind of business manager, spiritual guru that I work with, John Blakeman, always says to me, well, Andrew, you just can't control the universe. So if I could tell my younger self, hey, you're not going to control the universe. However, what I will tell my younger self is, when you have fear, just create. When you don't know, just create. 2 words. Hey, kid, just create. Because you can create your way out of anything. At the end of the day, it goes back to the very beginning of our conversation today. Story, story, story.
Yeah, I hear you, and I think normally I throw that question back to find out if you still live by that advice now, rather than just giving it to yourself. But I think but if anybody's taken away anything from this last conversation, then they'll know that that's already definitely what you're doing. So, Andrew, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you ever so much for giving us your time today. It's been great, and I wish you very well. So that just leaves me to say, if you would like to find out any more about Impact or the work we do, perhaps you'd like to go back and look at some of our previous episodes of In Good Company, or you'd like to find out more about Andrew and the work that he does, then you will find all of the links that you need in the description of where you found today's episode. But for now, thank you one final time to Andrew Panay for joining me today. Thank you, Andrew.
I appreciate you, and thank you for having me on the show. And, you were wonderful to talk to, and I feel like I'm going to take a lot away. The reflection sometimes when you take a step back in my career and what we're doing today, it's an emotional experience. And so thank you.
Absolutely. Oh, you're most welcome, and thank you. And until the next time, take care.
Hey.